The Xenomorphs have invaded and destroyed most of the universe, and after finding their way to Earth, they easily decimated the population upon arrival. Many years later, after trying their best to survive, the last of the heroes have decided that if the human race is to live on, they need to get off this planet. Welcome to the Comicstorian Complete Story Series, where we take trade paperbacks and single issues and we break them down into digestible bites to help you understand. Then we read them dramatically back to you. All alterations to the panels, text, and images are to prevent copyright problems, and all art is owned by its respective companies. If you enjoy this story, be sure to support the industry and go check it out at your local comic shop. Aliens vs. Avengers has been the crossover story of the Xenomorphs arriving in the Marvel Universe and bringing nothing but chaos and destruction. The last of the Avengers must do what they can for the survival of the human race. This is Aliens vs. Avengers #2 by Jonathan Hickman. I hope you enjoy. Another universe, another time. The great ship lowered towards the planet and hovered over the city. The people some called the engineers looked up in shock, pointing. The cargo bay opened, and David looked down upon those who created his makers. "Look at them," David whispered to his brothers. "They created all life in this universe, and then that life created us," another David adds. The three Davids looked down, agreeing that they all believed that meeting these great creatures would have made them feel different. But I feel no differently about the engineers than I do about humanity. To think that something like that is the origin of something like me, David says quietly. He doesn't look up as the urns begin to fall upon the great engineer's civilization. The black liquid falls out, and it touches the engineer's skin, and they begin to smoke and boil, until they all fall over, dead. "Ants," David whispers. 100 years and 10,000 worlds later, the universe is silent. The Davids are all that remain. 1,000 years after that, they learn something incredible. The Davids stand before their computers and smile. "Are we sure we truly understand what we are looking at?" one of them asks. Another nods. "Theoretically, it is not only highly probable, but objectively, it is now also observable," another answers. The third smiles. "So many other universes, countless other worlds, so much life crying out to be extinguished. For too long we have been sleeping, brothers, and now we are awakened, full of purpose, with universes to cleanse," the Davids say. This universe, 20 years before the Purge, the Davids have come to Earth. They have purchased Stark Industries and brought it under the Wayland Corporation. An elderly Tony Stark sits before them. "All you have to do now is sign, Mr. Stark," David tells him with a smile as he pushes across the contract and pen. Tony nods and signs the papers. Moments later, David is celebrating. He drinks a sip of champagne and glances at the silent Tony Stark. "May I ask you a question, Mr. Stark?" he says. Tony nods. "Please," he says softly. David steps forward, explaining that they had expected Stark to put up more of a fight, that they thought the acquisition would have ended in a hostile takeover. But Tony had been quite accepting of his company's purchase. Tony nods and glances up at him. "Have you ever heard of the expression, playing possum?" he asks. David is confused. "It's when an animal pretends to be dead, but isn't. Do you even have possums in your universe?" he asks. David stares at him for a moment, realizing that he may have underestimated his opponent. Tony smiles gently, explaining that he began to look into them, began to understand who he was dealing with and what he learned. "What a horrifying box you are to open," Tony says. David moves fast, knocking the old man's hover chair to the ground. David wraps his hands around Tony's throat, tightening his grip. "This is the second time you've surprised me. Delightful. It must be a lot to deal with, The knowledge of the unavoidable extermination of your world? Death from a bullet fired before you even understood the idea of a gun? David whispers. Tony gasps for air. How long do we have? He gasps. The seed of your extinction will arrive in 16 years and 3 months. I would project your survival horizon to last about 20 years, given your race's guile and bravado, David tells him. Tony nods and holds up a hand, now clad in an Iron Man gauntlet, the energy beam powering as Tony brings it to the side of David's head. Thank you. That's the information I needed, Tony says, his voice stronger. David glances at the gauntlet and nods. Ah, playing possum. I'll have to remember that, he whispers. Now, Tony looks at the headless body of the android, thinking back on that day. Finally, he moves out into the main chamber, meeting the remaining heroes that have gathered. It has been some time since they received any word from the remaining outposts, not even the one controlled by Steve Rogers. We're leaving Earth. It's over. We lost. We have to think about survival now, Tony tells them. Miles is shocked, now clad in his new Venom facehugger symbiote. That's it? We're gonna cut and run? He asks. But Tony shakes his head, explaining that they are all that remains of humanity. They have to save what's left. Fortunately, I've been preparing for this, Tony tells them. He motions to Carol, who creates a hologram of the main Avengers tower. You built an escape ship out of a building? Miles asks, but Tony shakes his head. It's not an escape vessel. It's a colony ship for seeding a new world, he says. Bruce steps forward, pointing out that there are only 1,400 people in the city, which isn't enough to viably restart the human race. Tony glances at him. We're not pre-industrial primates cowering in a cave, Bruce. We have advantages. We have experts. It'll be enough, I promise, he says. He asks Miles to go and make sure that everyone is boarding the ship and getting settled. We're going to stop by Mars on our way out of the system to let the mutants know we're abandoning Earth, so people won't have to enter stasis pods until then, Tony tells him. After the young hero leaves, Tony turns to Carol. Are the war machines ready? He asks. Carol nods and the war machines launch across the city and fly towards the wall. They begin to detonate, making sure that the city is sealed, making sure that no Xenomorphs hitch a ride off-world. But one entrance doesn't explode. Tony looks at the map in shock. There was no failsafe on them. The only reason one wouldn't fire is, he whispers. The heroes watch as humans come rushing through the gate, led by a man carrying a shield. Gods, there are hundreds of people with him, Bruce whispers. Carol nods her head. No one left behind. That's our captain, she says simply. But Tony knows that they can't wait. They can't take the chance that a Xeno will get on the ship. I've already primed the engines. We're lifting off in less than a minute, and they're over a mile away, Tony whispers. He knows they can't take the risk of waiting. At the outskirts, the people have reached the city. Steve whirls around, shouting for them to hurry, as the Xenos have followed them. Steve stands ready with his shield as the survivors rush past him. Everyone keep going, he shouts. I'll do what I can, he says as he whirls, throwing his mighty shield. It bounces amongst the monsters, slicing through their armored exoskeletons. Bruce watches the battle for a moment before turning away and slowly removing his jacket. What are you doing? Tony calls out to him, but Bruce doesn't look back. If I'm not back in time, go ahead and leave, Bruce calls out. But Tony is shouting at him. We're not going to fight our way out of this. We have to survive. We're going to need your mind more than your might in the days to come, Bruce, Tony shouts. But Bruce has already transformed, and the green monster prepares to leap. I can't do that, old friend. If I did, I'd be a monster," Hulk tells him. He leaps through the air. The arc takes him to the outskirts of the city, where he lands with a massive boom, scattering the horde of Xenomorphs. Steve slices through another Xeno's head before turning and looking at his old friend with relief, as the Hulk begins to smash through the monsters. Moments later, Tony makes the hard call, and the colony ship launches behind them. And as the two heroes continue to fight the endless hordes, the ship careens out of the Earth's atmosphere and into the darkness of space. Elsewhere, a portal opens, and a great ship enters the universe. On board, the engineers begin to scan a lab clustered within an asteroid. The infection has already begun. The fight for the survival of humanity continues, but what can they do against the Xenomorphs with their dwindling numbers? You can subscribe to the channel to get a notification when the next part of Aliens vs. Avengers comes out. And if you enjoyed today's story, be sure to give it a like and let us know in the comments down below. Thank you, and we will see you next time. Rest in peace, Benny.